Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Today we are covering the next Ankama game in the series as promised. Okay, I'm sorry, I did get sidetracked, but we are covering Dofus today. Dofus is Ankama's hit MMORPG. Never heard of it? Well, it's pretty big in other countries, namely French-speaking, while here in the West, it's pretty unknown. The game was released all the way back in 2004 in France, while the rest of us got the game roughly in 2005. Ankama is, after all, a French company, so it would make sense to release the game in their home region, as well as the audience for their games in general being largely French-speaking. Dofus is a free-to-play tactical turn-based MMORPG that was originally developed in Flash. It garnered quite a big following, spawning essentially the Ankama empire of games that I mentioned in the Wakfu video. Dofus started it all, so it has to be something special, right? Well, I've been playing Dofus for a few weeks now, and I think I'm ready to share why you may or may not want to give Dofus a shot. More specifically, the current updated version of Dofus, not Dofus Retro. That will be a whole other video. Or Dofus Touch, which is a mobile phone game also completely separate from Dofus. Anyways, let's dive into the world of the 12. The story and world of Dofus takes place in the world of the 12. The 12 are a reference to the 12 gods that name the main classes. The main story follows your character on the quest to find the 6 Dofus dragon eggs. Once again, sort of like Dragon Balls, those who can collect all of the Dofus eggs will be granted amazing power. The journey for the Dofus starts with character creation. Dofus predates Wakfu, so a lot of the simplistic options you saw in Wakfu are here in Dofus as well, in terms of how you can make your character look. But the game makes up for this in the amount of choices you have in classes. Dofus currently has 19 classes to play, all of them playing vastly differently from one another. Many of them are also in Wakfu, but there is a newly added class in Dofus that is not in Wakfu. All of the classes in Dofus relatively work the same, but for consistency's sake, I'll list them all here again. There is Ekaflip's Coin, the unpredictable fighter, Enrip's Hands, the healer, Iop's Heart, the reckless warrior, Kraw's Range, the archer, Feka's Shield, the protector, Sakir's Blood, the berserker, Sedita's Shoe, the druid, Ozumota's Whip, the summoner, Unatrof's Fingers, the treasure hunter, Sram's Shadow, the assassin, Zeller's Sandglass, the time mage, Pandoa's Pint, the drinking fighter, Masquerader's Mystic, the stance-shifting fighter, Foggernot's Steam, the mechanic, Eliotrope's Portal, the teleporting fighter, Hopper Mage's Rune, the elementalist, Ujinok's Rage, the barbarian, and finally the newly added class, Forge Lance's Heritage, the lancer. Oh, and the rogue. The names are all weird, but they all have a role that can fit anyone's gameplay style. Also, one thing I never noticed that someone in the comment section in my Wakfu video pointed out is the puns in the class names. Things like Sedita is an anagram for Adidas, the shoe company, hence why the druid class is called Sedita's Shoe. Zeller is an anagram for Rolex, and so on. I have no idea how I never noticed these puns, but I just wanted to make it known. Dofus is a very simple looking game with a 2D cartoony art style that I personally love. Basically, any computer under the sun in the modern day can run Dofus now. Characters and environments are pretty lively with lots of color and smooth animations. Music is also relatively solid, with many of its tunes being incredibly relaxing or atmospheric. Combat is a bit more upbeat, obviously, to give the rush of danger, but if I'm being honest, nothing really stuck with me in terms of Dofus's music, but that's just my opinion. After you create your character, you play a pretty quick tutorial, which is completely skippable, might I add. It teaches you the basics such as movement, talking to NPCs for questing, interacting with objects, crafting, and finally the meat of Dofus, its tactical turn-based combat.
He said it! He said it!
Much of your time in Dofus is going to be spent in combat, so let's take a quick dive into it. Anytime you are wandering in the world of Dofus, you will see groups of enemies you can engage in battle with. Clicking on them starts the positioning phase where you can place where your character begins combat. During this time, anyone can jump into the fight with you and help you defeat the monsters you are battling, unless you close your party group to prevent people from assisting. I like the way anyone can jump in and help you fight enemies, since it actually encourages player interaction, since as far as I could tell, there wasn't any drawbacks to letting other players fight with you. Once the battle begins, players and enemies go in turn order, moving their characters and slinging spells until a win or a loss. In the early levels, things like positioning or how spells synergize with one another won't really matter, but later on, or in dungeon content, where enemies are a lot tougher, your ability to read the battlefield becomes much more needed. Solo players will appreciate that, like Wakfu, there is a sidekick system, which is a controllable party member that you can use in battle that will help fill out a group if you can't find other players. Unfortunately, much like Wakfu, sidekicks are largely obtained in the cash shop, with only a few of them being earnable in-game, but at least there is an option for solo players. The combat is simple in its design, but masterful in its execution. Lovers of the tactical turn-based genre will absolutely enjoy the combat system in Dofus. The combat goes even deeper with the variety of character classes and builds you can have in Dofus. Certain classes cause major status effects, can push or pull enemies and allies, summon extra creatures, raise or lower statistics, and the list goes on. For a game released all the way back in 2004/2005, it's funny to think that modern MMORPGs today have less variety in its combat roles than the simple-looking Dofus. Besides the combat, what else does Dofus offer for players? Well, like any other MMORPG, there is questing, puzzles, community interaction, dungeons, and crafting. Questing in Dofus sort of works like your generic quests you'll find in other games. Most quests are going to boil down to defeating a certain number of enemies or collecting an item. Sometimes it's more involved, with some quests presenting a puzzle you have to solve. It's not too often, but typically the solutions are pretty simple. Questing is actually quite lucrative though in Dofus, as it's one of the best ways to gain experience, money, or items, at least in the beginning. Questing also ties loosely into achievements. Achievements in Dofus reward experience, titles, name banners called ornaments, items, money which is called commas, and achievement points. As you progress, I recommend completing quests you come across as well as achievements to help boost your leveling progress. Dungeons in Dofus are less spectacular compared to other MMORPGs though, because of its combat system. Essentially, entering a dungeon presents you with several normal fights, where you will fight a group of enemies and then a boss at the end of it. Not much past that. Many of the dungeons will feel cut and paste, since realistically, they are. One dungeon you will fight go balls, another dungeon you will fight skeletons. I can give this a bit of slack though, because honestly, with how Dofus works, what else could you really add to make dungeons more engaging besides combat? And honestly, Wakfu had this problem too. Crafting in Dofus is basically the same as it is in Wakfu, bar some differences in professions. There is your gathering professions, which include fishing, alchemist, farmer, lumberjack, miner, hunter. Then there is your crafting professions, which are artificer, carver, handyman, jeweler, shoemaker, smith, and tailor. Then there is your specializations, which is carve magus, costume magus, craft magus, jewel magus, shoe magus, and smith magus. From here you can probably guess how everything comes together. Your gathering jobs collect materials, which can be converted to crafted items using your crafting professions. Specializations add options to your equipment that you craft if you choose the said specialization. So for instance, if you choose jewel magus, you can augment and change stats on jewelry. Crafting simplicity isn't a bad thing, honestly. MMORPGs that have needlessly complex crafting systems tend to be annoying and hard to understand, so everything being so clear-cut in Dofus is actually better in my opinion. Player-owned housing is also in Dofus, with technically two forms of it. The Haven Bag, which is also in Wakfu, is a personal area you can visit at any time where you can store items, teleport places, and decorate it. You can also full-on purchase a house with in-game currency, which will offer even more room to decorate and even allow you to place things like crafting benches. Another activity players can take part in that was recently added is treasure hunting. Treasure hunting works sort of like RuneScape, where you are given a set of vague tasks to complete, and at the end you are rewarded for it. Even though you can start treasure hunting as early as level 20, most players will probably skip it until their later levels. levels. Plus, unless you are looking up a guide, it's quite a trek away from the starting city. I mean, look at the size of the world of Dofus. It takes quite a while to travel from place to place, especially by foot, since you have to load each individual map, sort of like old school Legend of Zelda. And how could I forget PvP? Dofus has a bit more PvP than Wakfu, thankfully. You have your general dueling, which can be done by challenging another player to a PvP duel. Then there is alignment PvP, where players can toggle open world PvP through their chosen city faction, being angels or devils. Guild PvP is through a mode called Perceptor Battles, where guilds place a Perceptor on a map that will collect resources for them. Other guilds can attack that Perceptor to steal the resources. The guild who placed it can then defend it, which leads to guild PvP battles of 5 versus 5. If you are looking for ranked PvP, Dofus has the Colosseum, where you can engage in 1v1 or 3v3 ranked PvP battles. Lastly, there is also Alliance versus Alliance. AVA PvP has quite a bit to it, called Conquests, where alliances can conquer territory prisms marked on a map as well as certain cities. Of course, these conquered zones can be attacked by other alliances, and participating in PvP gives cosmetic rewards and resources. In general, there is at least content for PvP players in Dofus. It's kind of a shame that most competitive PvP all takes place at endgame though, which will require you to acquire the best equipment for your build, min-max your stat points with scrolls, and then finally grind all the way to the level cap, which is level 200. So it's safe to say by then you'll probably know how to best play your class. Obviously, progression ties to endgame content, so let's talk about Dofus's character progression and customization. Unlike Wakfu, where each level up gave you a singular point you would spend in various talents, Dofus instead gives you 5 ability points to spend in the various stats. Certain stats relate to elements which then power up those specific corresponding spells. Dofus essentially separates itself from Wakfu by allowing players to specialize in a specific stat, which then relates to an element. Basically, each class can have several ways of playing it depending on each specific stat you chose to focus. Of course, equipment also helps further build your character archetype by increasing those stats further, giving defense, more attack, better critical chance, or better drop rates. Lastly, scrolls can further increase your character parameters if they are below a certain number. Scrolls basically squeeze as much power out of your build, letting you increase stats you wouldn't normally even focus on. All of this information probably sounds really great for a free-to-play game, right? Well, Dofus isn't actually fully free to play. What? Like RuneScape, there is a free-to-play area and a pay-to-play area. The free-to-play area covers the tutorial zone called Incarnum and the first city called Astra. Any areas past these zones require a subscription to experience. Luckily, like many of Ankama's games, the cash shop or subscription services are actually very affordable. The subscription will only cost you roughly $6 a month. The longer time packs also throw in goodies along with slight discounts, so Dofus is probably one of the cheaper MMORPGs out there to play. The cash shop in general, like Wakfu, has really avoided the dreaded pay-to-win schemes of other games. Everything you find in the cash shop is either cosmetic or a service, like being able to change your class or name. Many things are even earnable by trading with other players, and they even have systems like veteranship that rewards you for subscribing for a certain amount of time. As a free-to-play game, Dofus essentially has to be played as a subscriber to get the most out of it, unfortunately. Not only does the subscription open up the rest of the world past the incredibly small free-to-play area, but it also lets you pick other servers. As a free-to-play player, you only get access to basically one server, which would be fine, but the problem is the server allows players to multi-box. Basically, most players who play on a regular server will play multiple characters at once rather than grouping with other players. To avoid this, Ankama made a single account server, which limits the amount of characters you can play at once. Unfortunately, you do need a subscription to play on that server. The other servers locked by subscription is a roguelike server where death resets your character's level back to 1. The other servers you see are basically all French speaking, which, like many of the Ankama games, if you are an English speaking player, you are going to find that most of the community speaks French or some other language. So there is definitely a slight language barrier for those who speak English, unfortunately. Either way you look at it, Dofus Dofus essentially requires a subscription to get the most out of the game, but honestly, with a subscription only being a few dollars, I believe it's worth the investment if you grow to like the game. Honestly, Dofus has quite a wonderful world to experience that is different from other MMORPGs on the market currently. But let's be real here. The game isn't going to appeal to the mass market. It's got turn-based combat, in a time where everyone wants action-based combat. It has 2D cartoony graphics, and it largely has a language barrier for English-speaking players. Dofus should be up there in terms of popularity with games like RuneScape and MapleStory, considering it released roughly in the same time frame. But sadly, it's always been a small niche game, at least in America. Let's start wrapping this video up. Dofus and Ankama in general have kept the spirit of tactical turn-based combat alive. If you are a fan of more slower, methodical combat systems, Dofus is a great game to play. The game has a free-to-play restriction, but its paid subscription is incredibly affordable, including the items in its cash shop. If you want to play an MMO that has a very fair asking price within its monetization, look no further than the Ankama Games. Class variety in Dofus is plentiful, with 19 playable classes available, as well as different ways to play them. There is a class for each playstyle, whether you want to do damage, protect others, control the battlefield, and so on. Ankama Games have always had a great 2D art style, and Dofus is no different. The art style and animations in the game are incredibly appealing to look at. The game has over 10 years worth of content to experience, with updates coming pretty frequently. I mean, the world map alone is freaking massive, so if you are worried about things to do, don't worry, you'll always have something. Lastly, for how often I cover games that have broken PvP or PvP that just isn't worth even doing, it's nice to see a game that actually does have PvP that's worth diving into. So for those on the fence about Dofus, you've probably asked yourself the question, what's the difference between Dofus and Wakfu? I mean, if I'm being honest, very little, at least at a glance. Sure, I could explain the main differences between the games, but on a surface level, they are incredibly similar. So honestly, some might just hop into Wakfu instead of Dofus, and the similarities just keep on coming. Just like Wakfu, if you don't like turn-based combat systems, obviously Dofus is not the game for you, which I'm sure you could make that decision by just watching the first couple minutes of the video. The Ankama Games in general have a relatively low population of English-speaking players. Sure, they are out there, but French players vastly outnumber the English speakers, so if you don't speak those other languages, you can feel a bit alienated. As you might have seen from the footage, some of the game's UI and systems are kinda clunky. Things like navigating map to map feels really slow, and even opening some menus have a bit of a delay to them. As far as I understand, this is probably a limitation of the game's engine, which is hopefully going to be remedied when Dofus moves to Unity, but for the time being, it is a bit janky. Lastly, while there is a free-to-play version of the game, it basically demands this subscription. The free-to-play features are just too small to really even call it free-to-play. It feels like more of a demo. Luckily though, as stated, the sub fee is incredibly cheap. Hey, we finally covered Dofus. Can't believe it's been over 3 years since my Dead or Alive video on it. Sheesh. Next, we will be covering the newest MMO in Ankama's lineup, Waven, which released not too long ago. In the meantime, as always, comment down below if you play Dofus or plan to play it. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to my channel to help support my content. Follow all my social media down below in the description. And as always, I hope to see you in the next video. Until next time, everyone.